Overcoming by Pure Foisgirl. Chapter 44. With the warmth of their bath behind them, Hannibal returned to his own suite, bundled into a bathing sheet, while Will went to fetch something he said he needed. He was still tingling from the blissful confirmation that had occurred in the tub, the gentle but insistent scenting and closeness that had eased them both. The part of himself that had been unsettled, unsteady, and deeply unhappy during his departure was now calm and quiet, reassured through scent and touch that his husband was near at hand. He heard the door to Will's suite open and the scramble of claws clicking on tile before Winston came barreling through the open door at a mad dash, tongue lolling. Hannibal chuckled, hastily escaping into his dressing room to change into his underclothes and dressing gown before the excited dog could reach him. "He's missed you," Will said when he emerged, standing in the doorway still in his warm bathrobe, looking damp and delectable and dangerously approachable.
"I can tell,"
Hannibal said, grinning when Winston jumped up to plant both forepaws on his stomach, tail wagging. He cut a sly look at Will and said,
"He certainly never leaves me in doubt."
Will's brows shot up, both of them disapproving, and he asked, "Have I left you in doubt, Hannibal?"
"Never,"
Hannibal said, his sharp-toothed grin widening. He ruffled Winston's ears and pushed him down, gesturing the dog away as he moved to his valise.
"I apologize for the state I was in. I was eager to return to you. I must have looked frightful."
"Not that I can recall," Will said, edging through the doorway. There was a faint trace of tension to him that reminded Hannibal that his husband had never come in here of his own volition. He did, however, find Will's scent lingering at his bed, and took ridiculous satisfaction in the thought that Will might have slept here in his absence.
"Here, come in, have a seat,"
Hannibal said, extending the invitation purposefully, pleased when Will relaxed. He opened his valise and removed the packets from Mr. Buddish, asking,
"Are you chilled?"
"No, my robe is quite warm, thank you," Will said, moving to take a seat in the little receiving area before the fire hastily laid while they were in the bath. He watched Hannibal open the packets, blue eyes bright and curious. "You've been to see Mr. Buddish?"
"Yes, so often that his wife was prepared to level charges of infidelity against me,"
Hannibal murmured, sorting the pages rapidly and reshuffling them in an order he preferred. "Has there been word about Abigail?" Will asked, amused that Hannibal was so preoccupied he had to press him for information.
Pardon my distraction, Will. Yes, the emancipation was granted, and her name change is being processed,"
Hannibal said, taking the seat next to Will's with the little spindle-legged table between them.
"Hobbs was captured in Chesterton. I'm sure news reached you here by now. I expect the moment he drops on the scaffold, she will be free to take up a new life."
"And we are prepared to assist her?" Will inquired, making a note to write to the Fosters immediately.
"The Lord Chancellor and Mr. Buddish are managing her transition,"
Hannibal answered, reaching across the table to wipe a droplet of water from Will's cheek and smooth his damp curl behind his adorable ear.
"I asked to be contacted before the execution. I don't feel as if Abigail should be alone when her father faces his just consequences."
"No, she shouldn't," Will said, pained to think of Abigail in such a circumstance. "How awful even just to hear of it. It must seem so unreal, like a nightmare."
"Not for much longer. The Fosters have been writing to her through Mr. Buddish directly, and the Lord Chancellor has taken a personal interest in her welfare. Before any of us realize, she will be Abigail Foster, and can put the entirety of her life before this point behind her, if she so wishes."
Will frowned, thoughtful and serious, as he always was when his mind was addressing an issue which concerned him. His somber blue eyes searched out Hannibal's, liquid with sadness, when he asked, "Do you think we will ever bring her here to Hartford?" Hannibal echoed his frown, drawing a deep breath as he considered the question. "It's only that we will surely remind her of something she would sooner forget," Will added, smoothing a fold of his robe over his knee, fingers tracing the embroidered border. "If she strives to forget her past, will we be forgotten as well?"
"There is a danger of that, yes,"
Hannibal answered, having thought along similar lines.
"She will need time to adjust to her new life, time to get to know the Fosters. But her mother was my wife, however briefly, and Abigail was born in this house, if such a violent act can be considered a birth. I have every hope and expectation that when she is comfortably settled enough that her curiosity outweighs her reservations, she will seek to know more about her mother, and wish for a deeper connection with us both."
"I hope so," Will said, patting his thigh to get Winston's attention. He sank both hands into the dog's soft, mint-scented fur, idly rubbing his ears. "I realize that things would have gone very differently for her had we not arrived. But I dislike that we will forever be haunted by the spectre of Louise Hobbs and the horror of her dying right before Abigail's eyes. I wish for a chance to create much more pleasant memories under much happier circumstances."
"We will,"
Hannibal said, with unfailing alpha confidence.
"It will take some time, but those memories may yet be made. Have hope in that potential, Will."
"Hope is not something I excel at," Will reminded him, gracing Hannibal with a wry, fond smile. "But you have the unusual ability to inspire it in me, just as you've no doubt inspired it in every Omega in the country with your statement to the press." Hannibal caught Will's sideways glance, a smile curving his lips. "We get the paper the same day now, thanks to the railway. I saw the article about the council, and am reminded again that you are nothing if not incredibly impressive, Lord Clarges." Hannibal grinned, heavy alpha fangs bared in a flashing gleam.
"Solely due to the influence of my beautiful and dangerous mate, I assure you."
Will cocked his head, affection shining in his eyes as he said, "Oh, I can't claim all the credit, Hannibal, but I appreciate the sentiment. And I realize that you're attempting to get me into a conciliatory mood."
"Is it working?"
"The ogling in the washroom didn't hurt," Will whispered, gesturing at the papers. "I trust this isn't another separation agreement."
"Gods, no, never that. Quite the opposite, actually,"
Hannibal said, fingers sliding over the papers to smooth them. His nerves were wound tight, entirely unlike him, but the thought of hurting Will again plagued him with pain, and it was all he could do not to fidget. Clearing his throat, he handed a stack of papers to Will.
"Some time ago, I had Mr. Buddish go through my assets and amend my will to make provisions for your care. The annotations at the bottom include you in matters of my inheritance and the disposition of the estates in my name. I'll need you to sign them, of course, when we have grandfather awake to witness."
Will took the papers as he spoke, brows drawing together in a soft, bewildered frown as he read the notations. The provisions added by Mr. Buddish were dated days before, with Hannibal's own initials added, and dated earlier that afternoon.
"The entitlements are such that I could not alter them, being unfortunately set in perpetuity,"
Hannibal said, handing Will another stack.
"But this grants you the interests and profits from the estates, and places my material goods equally in your name. I was able to open an account for your use in the capital, including you in all lines of credit extended in my name. The bills will be written up by Mr. Buddish from my own income."
Will's eyes grew wider with each line he read, confusion and shock evident on his beautiful face. He lifted his hand from Winston's head to sift through the papers, reading them quickly but with discerning intent.
"These provisions, here,"
Hannibal said, handing him another sheaf of papers, his tone quiet and unassuming, uncertain how to interpret Will's continued silence.
"Settle the bulk of my endowments on the eldest of our male children, with allotments set aside for any other children we may have. There's quite enough to go around, unless we find ourselves with several dozen, which is by no means meant to dissuade you, should you wish for so many. I trust with your business sense we will claim an even more substantial fortune by the time they have need of it."
Will swallowed down the tightness in his throat, aware of the nervousness and tight apprehension trickling into him from his bond to Hannibal, though his husband was studiously attempting to control it. He read each line carefully, giving it the weighty consideration it was due, breathing slowly and shallowly to keep from bursting into relieved tears. Because as much as that addendum had wounded him, here in his hands was the proof that Hannibal wanted nothing more than a future with him, well provided for and securely settled in life as his husband, with their heir and children poised to be bestowed with the fruits of their labors. Whatever he had meant with that addendum, whatever that cruel someone had hoped for in revealing it, Will had been correct in declaring it meaningless. This was the truth. This was the man who loved him with such unreserved passion that Will all but drowned in the beauty of it. "It must have taken weeks to get this information gathered," he whispered, not trusting his voice enough to speak too loudly. His shining eyes flicked to his husband, the addendum a painful pressure in the pocket of his dressing gown, a thorn yet waiting to prick them both when it was removed. "What prompted this sudden interest in amending your will?"
It isn't sudden,
Hannibal said, still uneasy, but offering Will a crooked smile.
Shortly after the masquerade, I had Mr. Buddish begin an accounting of my assets. We were able to finalize everything this morning, thankfully. It's natural, isn't it, for a husband to wish to provide for his spouse?
I understand you want me provided for, and you are far too generous on every count. But was there another reason? Do you have some worry I should know of? Hannibal looked away from him, his profile so perfect it seemed carved from marble, the smooth face of a deity who should be unconcerned with mortal fears, yet was plagued by them. Plagued by regrets of time lost, and wounds delivered, and lives slipping through his hands on the battlefield, by news from the front of those in need, and a righteous sense of justice greatly offended. "Soldiers heading south," Will whispered, remembering how they had watched them march into the distance, and the promise Hannibal had pointedly not made.
"Will,"
Hannibal said, his name thick with emotion as he shook his head.
"Please."
"The war," Will said, and Hannibal flinched as if speaking it would somehow make it true. "Seeing them marching south worried you, didn't it? You feared the war would somehow reclaim you, and you wished for me to be legally settled before it did so in case you should not come back?"
"Yes,"
Hannibal said, striving for calm, doing his best to keep his emotions from translating to Will through the bond. "They can't call you back, Hannibal," Will said, trailing off for a moment before asking with uncertainty. "Can they?"
"I was the chief medical officer, Will,"
he said, opting for the brutal honesty his mate expected of him.
Had grandfather not bought my commission and arranged for a skilled physician to take my place, there's every chance I would have never left the front. A doctor is of much more value to the government than a duke's heir.
It settled like a cobweb over Will's heart, faint and unnerving wisps of fear and dread floating in tendrils around him, invisible but unavoidable. "Has something changed?" he asked, his heart picking up its pace just from the stillness that fell over his husband, just from the monumental effort he was putting into dampening the bond. "Hannibal, has something changed?"
Lord Rathmore reminded me that he is endowed with the ability to send me back to the front,
Hannibal said, calm and rational and retreating into reserve.
I had gone to discuss the issue of my freight request being denied, and we quarreled regarding it, and regarding our inquiries into his business dealings. He said I could have ample room for shipments were I active duty once more.
"We will find another way," Will insisted, his stomach dropping and a hollow terror winding up through his soul. "Hannibal, please, promise me you won't do anything rash."
"I won't do anything rash,"
Hannibal promised, pained.
"But we shall have to be more circumspect into our investigation regarding your sister's husband, if we do not wish for me to be suddenly ordered back to the front."
"Surely, if grandfather drafts an official statement naming you as his heir, Timothy will do no such thing. He's not a brave man. His own fear of the consequences will keep him from a decision that would certainly ruin him," Will said, hardly able to force the words out past the tightness in his throat, and unable to trust the impression he'd received from Timothy to tell the entire truth of him.
"One can only hope,"
Hannibal breathed, composing himself.
"Regardless, I wanted to ensure that you were looked after in comfort should anything happen to me. We are none of us promised a tomorrow."
The depth of the love he felt for Hannibal struck Will like a hammer on glowing, molten metal, reshaping the vessel of his heart into something so much more beautiful than it had been before. He thought of losing Hannibal to the battlefront, and clenched his teeth against the bone-deep terror it inspired, his frightening imagination gracing him with a vision of the future that was bleakly empty, bereft of the man who meant so much to him. "No, we certainly aren't," Will whispered, looking down at the papers in his hands and blinking away tears. "But you made certain any tomorrow I had without you would not suffer from lack of comfort. Hannibal, this is far too much."
"It isn't enough by far,"
Hannibal said, clearing his throat, in anticipation of explaining the next document he was ready to hand over.
"But you are properly acknowledged as my husband, and able to live independently as such, should you choose to do so."
Will frowned, reminded of the decision he had yet to make official to his husband, the one which could part them, the choice he was always free to make when it suited him.
"And I fear I have a confession which might sway you,"
Hannibal murmured, his voice falling to a whispered purr more felt than heard, the words accompanied by a pang of anxiety Hannibal simply couldn't prevent. It brought Will to sharp awareness of his husband, his mind cataloguing Hannibal's taut posture, the tight lines around his mouth, the set of his golden eyes as he held a document out across the small space between them. For a moment, Will was certain that Hannibal was handing him the addendum, the original which had been filed with Mr. Buddish. He took it reluctantly, bracing himself to hear the explanation Hannibal might give, wondering if everything that had come before it was meant to console him for the loss they had orchestrated, compensation for what was set to occur should he bear Hannibal a child. But it wasn't that at all.
I asked Mr. Buddish to draw up paperwork, naming you the sole and legal owner of Hertford House itself, as well as the estate. As you know, the agreement grandfather drew up provided you ownership only until you bear an alpha son,
Hannibal said, worriedly observing Will for signs of upset or unease.
As Mr. Buddish pointed out, I have no legal say over Hertford in its current disposition, but he did create a contract on my behalf stating I cede any claim to you.
Will trembled, his wide, disbelieving eyes fastened on the paper without seeing it, his mind seizing on the fact that Hannibal had effectively nullified the addendum, willfully, deliberately, insistently so. Without knowing Will was aware of it, he had taken steps to have it legally stripped of meaning, rendered inert in the eyes of the law, to place Will once more irrefutably as the master of the house.
In the event you do bear an alpha son, and control of the house reverts to me, this paper effectively surrenders my claim in your favor, reinstating you as the legal owner for the rest of your life,
Hannibal said, growing more anxious the longer Will was silent. There was a plea in his husky, deep voice when he insisted.
You needn't worry about your place here in Hertford, Will. This paper ensures it will never be taken from you under any circumstance, not by me, not ever.
The words swam before Will's eyes, wiggling about on the page to the point that he had to close them out and take a deep breath. They appeared on the back of his lids, line by line in perfect memory, putting Hertford House solely in his hands to be given on his death to a person of his choosing. "Why would you do this?" he whispered, eyes still closed, the paper quivering in his trembling hand. "Hannibal, why would you ask Mr. Buddish to draw up such a thing?" Hannibal had spent the entire trip home attempting to come up with reasons, with an explanation that would accurately convey his intentions. Yet the charm and eloquence he prided himself on, so effortless with others in his social circle, seemed to fail him at every turn with Will, leaving only awkward truth and painful consequences. Always consequences.
When I first returned to Hertford, in the wake of the letter you sent me,
he said, watching Will's eyes move restlessly behind closed lids as if searching for something.
It was to find that grandfather had created an addendum to the previous agreement he'd drawn up, the one which placed Hertford in your possession.
Will took a shaky breath, focusing on Hannibal's words, on the anger and self-recrimination he could trace through the fibers of his bond.
The addendum stated that with the birth of any living child of ours, Hertford would revert to myself, and he would make arrangements for a separation should I so choose, leaving you only the length of his life to remain at Hertford,
Hannibal admitted, shame darkening his high cheeks.
After which you would only be allowed to live here on my sufferance.
Winston whined, uneasy with the tension he sensed in them both, his dark eyes flicking from Will to Hannibal. He poked his nose under Will's lax hand, trying to cajole him, and Will began to pet him, drawing on the comfort he offered.
I signed it without hesitation, of course,
Hannibal whispered, growing more uneasy with every moment, numb terror taking hold of him just to admit it at long last.
I began to attempt to woo you, such as I could manage in that state, but my intentions to strip Hertford from you changed very rapidly as I began to truly know you, Will. Please, you must believe me.
You signed it when you returned? Will asked, his mind catching on that detail. The addendum in his keeping was signed the day after his fall, the day they had left Hertford, not so long ago as the first day Hannibal had returned after 6 years of absence.
Yes, that very day,
Hannibal said, pausing for a moment. When Will said nothing more, he added,
That morning on the lane when you cut me with your crop, the day we finally began to be honest with one another, I went down and asked grandfather to have the addendum destroyed.
Will shook his head, his eyes fluttering open, his confusion tangible enough to taste.
He told me it would be simple enough to have the original destroyed, but that the copy had not yet been returned. That copy has remained unaccounted for,
Hannibal said, holding his gaze, his amber eyes steady and imploring.
And I decided to have legal documentation created to refute it on the chance that it resurfaced. But I felt I must tell you of its existence, Will. I want to be honest with you in all things, even when the truth holds the possibility for terrible consequences.
Why did you never tell me until now, Hannibal? Will asked, his eyes heavy with rebuke but showing no sign of rejection. If you truly signed it all that time ago and wished it to be destroyed, why did you wait until now to tell me? Hannibal wet his lower lip, silent for a long moment, speaking with care because the outcome was so dear to him.
At first, I hoped to have it destroyed without you ever knowing of it,
he admitted, a sardonic smile twisting his lips.
Coward that I was, I hoped to hide it from you and spare us both the disappointment of knowing what I'm capable of. And then I fell so deeply in love with you that I put it from my mind entirely. I had many opportunities to tell you, Will, I know that. Believe me, I know it. I wanted everything else in place, securing your position as well as your fortune before I spoke of it, so you would be certain of my intentions and not feel threatened by something which carries no weight any longer. His amber eyes sharpened, holding Will's own. I held my tongue for fear of hurting you, for fear of driving you away from me, but I want no more secrets between us, Will. I do not want to wake one day to find you've left me because that damn addendum has been found.
It has been found, Will said, watching Hannibal's eyes widen in surprise. I found it, Hannibal. I have the copy. Hannibal shook his head, mouth opening to speak, but before he could say anything, Will told him, It was left for me on my desk in my room just yesterday.
Left for you?
Hannibal echoed, panic filling his eyes to think that someone with such ill intentions had access to Will's suite. We've had dozens of new faces entering the house for Grandfather's gathering, and with everything in such chaos, it would have been very simple for someone to slip it in here undetected, Will said, trying to believe his own logic and not fall victim to his own fears on that count. Someone who very dearly wished me to be hurt by finding it. Hannibal flinched, dropping his gaze to Winston, looking anywhere but at Will's calm, unmoved face. He recalled that expression all too well from the early days of his homecoming, the smooth exterior that shut him out in every regard. And he feared that he was being shut out once again, only this time, when the door closed, it would lock for good and all.
Will, I know it must have hurt you.
Angered me, Hannibal, Will said, reflecting on how disturbed he'd been in the hours following its discovery. It angered me, not just because the two of you schemed behind my back with no regard for my well-being, but because it had been signed the very morning we left for Marsham Heath. It was Hannibal's turn for confusion, absolute bewilderment pulling his mouth into a frown and tightening his eyes. I could not help but think that surely you had tried to manage the issue in your favor, that your sudden kindness and regard were merely the result of your desire to regain Hertford House, despite knowing full well it was anything but. Yet you insist you signed it far before that moment?
Will, that addendum was signed upon my return. I swear it to you,
Hannibal told him, shaking his head.
Perhaps there was some confusion with the copy. May I see it?
Will reached into his dressing-gown pocket, sliding it forth, admitting, It was my intention to question you regarding it, Hannibal. I've kept it locked in my jewelry box for safekeeping, since things seem to have a habit of wandering off. Hannibal took it from him, confounded when he saw that it was indeed the missing copy, but with a vastly different date from the original.
Will, I promise you the date on this paper is false,
he said, dropping his hands into his lap, paper and all, lest they betray his nerves by trembling.
You may ask Grandfather, he will tell you the same, or Mr. Buddish, as I discussed this with him in detail when I had my assets accounted for.
Will studied him, Hannibal's earnest dismay offering another layer of relief to his certainty that he had the right of things, just as he told Mina.
I would not lie to you. I cannot lie to you.
I know you wouldn't, Will murmured, taking the paper from him again. Perhaps it was simply a mistake, but with it being left for me as it was.
Someone intended for you to see it, and assume that everything that has passed between us was my grand design to disenfranchise you.
Hannibal said, stricken, paling with mingled anger and hurt.
Nor would I blame you for believing so.
Will folded the paper up carefully and laid it with the others Hannibal had given him, splaying his hand on the stack in his lap. I didn't believe so, he admitted, giving Winston another rub on his head. Even when I first saw it, I rejected it. I was hurt, and understandably so, that the two of you would ever seek to cause me such harm in such an underhanded way. But if you signed it the day of your return, that does make things a little more clear.
Does it?
There's a world of difference between the man who used to be my husband and the man who is my husband, Will said, a simple statement that drove trembling hope into Hannibal's heart like a spike, threatening to bleed him dry with pain should it be removed. Grandfather no doubt felt it was the only option he had for elector heir, and you saw a chance to reclaim your birthright from someone you felt had stolen it from you. From the cold standpoint of logic, those actions seem reasonable, though cruel. The vivid blush on Hannibal's cheek spoke volumes about his feelings on the subject, and only intensified when Will said, Had you only asked, I would have given it back to you, Hannibal. Even had we never reconciled, my every intention was for Hertford to belong to a proper lector.
It does belong to a proper lector. It belongs to you, Will, and now it always will.
Will drew a soft breath that was heavy with Hannibal's alpha scent, sharpened by his agitation and upset. He shook his head a little, tapping the papers with his fingertips before saying, We need to take all of this to Grandfather and alter it, Hannibal. I understand you wished to ensure I would never be in doubt of your sentiments when you told me of the addendum, but I would never wish to take control of Hertford House under such circumstances.
That isn't why I did it, Will,
Hannibal said, braving his unwavering gaze once more.
I want you to have Hertford because I want this to be your home, our home, together. I never want you to feel as if you might at any moment be adrift in the world without an anchor.
I am never adrift in the world. I have you, Hannibal. Our home is one another, and if everything else that has passed between us was not enough to send me packing, a misplaced piece of outdated documentation is hardly going to manage to do so, though some conspirator is going to be vastly disappointed in that decision, I'm sure.
Will,
my sister saw this, you know, Will said, chuffing a soft laugh that was more unhappy than anything. She was very persuasive in her arguments that you meant to deal me profound harm with such a thing. And I surprised myself by defending you. Hannibal held his breath, his amber eyes sparkling with hope that ached in Will's chest, as palpable as the heartbeat that beat the rhythm of his name. I told her it was cruel, Will said, fiddling with the corner of it, dog-eared from being shoved so hastily into his pocket. But ultimately meaningless.
It is meaningless. It was meaningless the moment you slung a fish at my face and made me eat my own pride.
Literally, Will whispered, a grin baring his modest Megan fangs, petite but sharp, and beautiful against the fullness of his mouth. He cocked his head, musing. I could be cross with you about this, Hannibal.
But you are never cross,
Hannibal said, his own smile hesitant.
Only thoughtful.
And I have thought about this quite enough, Will sighed, putting the papers aside. The eventual ownership of Hertford House has caused a great deal of strife and cost us both more peace of mind than we should rightfully be willing to part with. When all is said and done, Hertford House is just a place. It is beautiful and beloved, but it will stand long after you and I have been all but forgotten in this world. Our grappling and grasping makes no difference in the grand scheme of things.
Whether we are remembered or not, whether it makes a difference or not, it is important to me that I take nothing from you, Will,
Hannibal said, chin tipping up just a fraction, a shadow of his alpha pride rising to the fore.
I would have Grandfather's original arrangement changed to keep it in your control. And damn the day I ever signed the addendum and reject everything it stands for. I would offer you the world itself were it mine to give you, Will. Hertford House is little enough to solve the wound I've dealt you.
Will eased Winston's head from his knee and got to his feet, a slight smile curving his full lips. He slid between Hannibal's loosely spread legs and sank down to sit on one corded thigh, leaning in to wrap his arms around Hannibal's shoulders. He drew him close, eyes closing as Hannibal buried his nose in his throat, in the juncture of neck and shoulder where the dressing gown curved over his soft flesh. "I am very disappointed in you for signing that addendum," he whispered, holding him tight and smoothing his hair. "I'm even more disappointed in Grandfather for such a deceit. As clearly as I can understand what drove you both to it, I'm still very angry about it." Hannibal said nothing. He nuzzled closer to Will, clutching him hard, his breath coming in short, shallow pulses as he held his mate. "I'll be good and angry about it for a while, I suspect," Will admitted, stroking his nape. Goosebumps lifting on his skin as Hannibal's heated breath spilled over his throat. "It's somewhat of a luxury to me still, to be allowed to feel angry." Hannibal pulled Will's warm, welcoming scent deep into his lungs, filling himself with the only perfume he preferred, the sweet, hot, feverish scent of the Omega who held his heart in both perfect, cautious hands.
"I promise I will not complain when you cosh me," he whispered, lifting his head to nuzzle Will's delicate ear. "I will even take you fishing to find a suitably heavy trout."
Will chuckled softly, slumping against him with his arms wrapped tight around his husband. "Even though I'm angry, I'm relieved to hear the truth. Never hesitate to tell me the truth, Hannibal," he whispered, shivering when Hannibal grazed a kiss over the shell of his ear, a tickling brush of soft lips on his sensitive skin. "So, is there anything else you need to tell me?"
"No,"
Hannibal said, the word a rumbling purr in his ear. Finding himself rapidly distracted from his purpose by even so innocent a touch, Will eased back and held Hannibal's golden gaze. "Nothing?" he asked, cupping his jaw, his fingers pale against Hannibal's tawny skin. "I'm finding your generosity has inspired me, Hannibal. Now is the time to admit anything more you might be keeping from me."
"Only my burning desire to be close to you, having missed you so much these past few days."
Hannibal blinked, cat-like and slow. The corners of his lips curled up in faint humor, even as the bond began to settle into a brilliant, beautiful glow.
"Can you forgive me, Will?"
Hannibal's hands swept up his spine and down again in a soothing caress, and he turned his head to press a kiss to Will's wrist.
"Please forgive me, Will."
The quiet, heartfelt plea snared the red ribbon of their entwined lives, and followed it, reaching back to the very first time their eyes had met in front of Hertford House, to the moments they now found themselves in. It echoed like a whisper in a well, gaining force and momentum as it traveled back, touching every hurt and every circumstance that had parted them.
"I cannot claim to deserve it. I can only beg you to consider it."
Will loosed a small sigh, still caressing Hannibal's cheek, warm and weighty in his lap, and smiling ever so slightly. He pressed his forehead to Hannibal's, nuzzling nose to nose.
"I pray that some day,"
Hannibal said, a soft exhale over Will's lips,
"my love will fill in the cracks of all the pain I've caused you, and you will find it in your heart to forgive me, even just a little."
"I doubt I would have bothered defending you to my sister if I hadn't already forgiven you," Will murmured, his voice barely audible over the rush of blood in Hannibal's ears. A smile teased his full lips to part over pearly teeth, wry and gentle. "Just a little." The bond surged with joy, unrestrained and unquestionable proof of Hannibal's sincere love for him. "It would be churlish of me to refuse you," Will told him, eyes closing with soft laughter as his husband graced the tip of his snub nose with another soft kiss, fleeting and sweet. "Especially when I said I would be generous."
"You are generous,"
Hannibal said, squeezing Will close to him in another tight embrace, burying his nose in Will's damp, fragrant curls, nearly overcome by how dearly he loved his husband.
"I have promised to make you happy, Will, and I will keep my promise."
He nuzzled Will's nose again, moving to kiss him, but stopping short to whisper,
"May I?"
"No," Will said, shaking his head, but before Hannibal's smile could falter, he purred, "It's my turn," as he caught his husband's mouth in a hungry kiss. He tasted of sweetness and of welcome and of more forgiveness perhaps than he pretended to. He tasted of warmth and ferocity and unquenchable spirit, the indefinable essence that was Hannibal's home. He could live a lifetime in a single one of Will's tender kisses, spend an eternity in his husband's firm hands, open and yielding and eager to give him anything he wanted. Will's hands drifted to his chest, settling over his thudding heart as if lured there, smooth and hot and supple against him. The kiss deepened with Will's teasing nip, sharp enough to sting. The pain suckled away and swept free with the wet tip of his heated tongue. Hannibal purred, tipping his head to lavish Will's lips with kisses, dipping his tongue into the well of Will's mouth to find and tease his own. It was a keen, precious agony of anticipation to be kissed by Will, to have the firm weight of his glorious body slowly growing warmer in his arms. It was an agony Hannibal would gladly suffer, punishment for sins he was eager to atone for, hungry for the lash of Will's tongue and the dangerous nip of sharp teeth.
"I love you,"
he whispered over and over, moaning it into his mouth, breathing it against his lips, a mindless declaration of devotion pulled from him with each brush of Will's mouth over his.
"I love you."
It danced at the tip of Will's tongue, the compulsion to speak those words back to him almost too difficult to resist. He said them instead with his heart, with the tenderness of his touch as he stroked Hannibal's jaw and throat, with the gentle affection in his seeking kisses, and the soft sounds of approval that followed every urgent purr his husband uttered. They were slow to pull apart, drawn back by nuzzles and sighs to get lost in one another again, until they finally fell still, wrapped in each other's arms and oblivious to all else. "Are you still feeling generous?" Will whispered, easing back and shivering when Hannibal scented his throat again, murmuring against the cords of Will's neck.
"Entirely so,"
Hannibal confirmed, his smile easy and relaxed. "Then do a favor for me," Will suggested, casting a glance at the pile of papers on the table next to them. "Lock those up until morning, and have me accompany you when we speak to grandfather. I want to give my own assurances that his legacy is in good hands."
"As you are my husband,"
Hannibal said, giving Will another appreciative squeeze.
"I will do as you say. My strong box should serve well enough for now."
He reached for the stack of papers, but Will stayed him, an odd, cagey gleam in his dancing blue eyes. "There's room enough in my jewelry box for all of it," he said, sliding the papers into a neat stack. "You can lock it up for me, and I can bring it down come morning."
"It seems an odd place to keep documentation,"
Hannibal said, reaching for it again.
"We'll have to get you a proper safe to keep your important papers in. Wouldn't you rather I lock it in my own?"
"No," Will said, working hard to suppress his smile. "I insist it goes into my jewelry box. It's just inside my dressing room. Would you put it away for me?" As far as request went, it was an odd one, but certainly nothing Hannibal would refuse his husband. He merely gathered Will's hand to his lips and kissed it, telling him,
"Of course I will."
It earned him a kiss, short and light on the bow of his lips, before Will slid out of his lap with feline grace. He had hoped to coax Will into staying here with him, hoped to have a chance to hold him through the night, but he had no wish to push his luck and decided to let Will make the choice without his interference. "Come, Winston," Will said, patting his thigh to bring the eager dog to his side as Hannibal rose, the documents in hand. Hannibal graciously gestured Will before him, and he headed back toward his suite, a gleeful grin of anticipation on his lips.
"Didn't you say you had something to tell me, Will?"
Hannibal asked, focusing with difficulty, drawn over and again by the rich note to Will's scent that seemed stronger, perhaps maturing as the lingering effects of his suppressants faded. He tipped his head up to look at Will as they emerged into his suite, his drowsy delight fading only a little as his mate moved away from him toward his nightstand. Winston trotted to his basket bed and flopped down, his brown eyes flicking between his two people, alert in case either one of them decided to vanish once more. "I do," Will said, drawing a bracing breath. He fished the small silver key to his jewelry box out of his nightstand drawer, and came toward him, holding it out and offering. "But I think you should put those away first."
"Yes,"
Hannibal agreed, wetting his lower lip with the tip of his tongue and tasting Will there, faint but flavorful. He was heartened when Will smiled at him and began to turn down his bed, giving him no indication he would be sent away.
"I suppose I should."
It was very difficult for him to tear himself away from the sight of his mate in his bathing robe and slippers, briskly folding his covers down. Simplistic as it was, his heart swelled with joy just to see Will so at ease and unguarded, going about his usual nightly routine with effortless grace. He pocketed the key, however, and picked up a lamp to light his way, tucking the papers beneath his arms to open the dressing-room door. He placed the lamp in its bracket and turned the flame up, only to be confronted by the renovated space filled nearly to bursting with the clothing and items he'd ordered Will, and he suddenly realized why his husband had been so keen to maneuver him in here. He was due a caution, and he well knew it.
Will?
He turned the doorway, his explanation cut off by the pillow flung in his face. It dropped to the floor to the tune of his sputtering, only to be immediately followed by a balled-up lap blanket, which snagged on his head and momentarily blinded him. He tugged the blanket away with an indignant huff, finding himself face to face with his husband's amused, wry smile and laughing blue eyes. "At least it wasn't a marquetry table," Will said, thoroughly entertained by the expression on Hannibal's face. "And believe me, when I first saw all that being carried in, it certainly did occur to me that you were owed a caution."
"I rather hoped I would be,"
Hannibal admitted, noting how Will's hands fell to the tie on his robe, slowly undoing the knot.
"I do enjoy your capacity for violence."
"Don't you just?" Will murmured, the undone sash falling to his sides and the robe gaping open. "But I'm feeling generous, so I thought perhaps I might torment you with my knees instead." The robe slipped off, draping down the curve of his ivory shoulder before sliding down the length of his arm, clinging to his skin in such a way that Hannibal envied it. And he didn't even feel ridiculous doing so. "You should put those papers away," Will reminded him, a deft twist sliding the robe from his other shoulder to swing the heavy, lined material before him, swaying down the middle of his body in a waft of sweet Omegan perfume.
"I should."
Hannibal was vaguely aware of speaking, but couldn't for the life of him recall what he was agreeing to, until the robe was pitched at his head, the soft folds draping around his face in heavenly scent he wanted to bury himself in. By the time he pulled it free, Will was slipping into his bed, naked and supple and breathlessly beautiful. He patted the empty space next to him and said, "Hurry back, Hannibal, or else I may fall asleep before we can find out if I truly can strangle a man with my thighs." Hannibal Lecter, Marquess of Clarges, war hero and veteran doctor, had never moved faster in the entirety of his life than he did in that moment, and he had never been so delightfully rewarded for his haste. In the thick silence that fell over Hertford House in the dead of night, Will floated in a blissful, peaceful place of almost sleep, half smothered by Hannibal's large alpha body next to him, and loving every moment of it. He trailed his hands through the crisp hair on Hannibal's chest and asked, "Are you sleeping?"
"Nearly,"
Hannibal murmured with a stretch, his toes reaching for the foot of the bed as he sighed in contentment.
"No doubt I'll sleep better tonight at your side."
"I hope so," Will said, rubbing Hannibal's shoulder when he rolled against him, pressing Will into the bedding. Hannibal uttered a soft, rumbling purr that trailed off, fading to a sleepy grumble as he became aware of Will's slight tension.
"Is something troubling you, Will?"
he asked, fighting the temptation of sleep to caress his mate's slender side, finding the places where his scars trailed around to his flanks, smooth but pronounced. "I'm nervous about grandfather's gathering," Will said, frowning into the darkness. He stroked his husband's throat, taking comfort in his strength. "I'm not certain I'm ready to see my father again. I don't know that I would ever be ready to see him again, especially knowing he's part of that awful council."
"I wish he'd been present at the meeting,"
Hannibal said, a snarl unleashed in his words.
"Though perhaps it's lucky he wasn't. I might have truly lost my temper."
"I'm glad that didn't happen," Will said, letting Hannibal's scent and touch relax him, the sense of safety he felt in his husband's arms able to overcome any worry, no matter how distressing. "He isn't worth the effort, and he's certainly not a worthy adversary. He's just a bitter, cruel old man who never fathered a son, and blamed the rest of us for his own failings." Hannibal stirred atop him, shifting to his side to drape over him, compelled to enclose Will in a solid wall of flesh to chase away his fears.
"He's an old man who still haunts you, Will,"
he said, his voice a quiet throb in the still darkness.
"You no longer face him alone from a position of disadvantage. You will face him as his better, and with me by your side."
"Ready to defend me?" Will questioned, a soft laugh escaping him when Hannibal said,
"Yes. Not that you need it. I will, however, be ever at the ready to intercept anything irreplaceable you might feel compelled to fling at his head. I must remind Hawks to place very heavy Very dangerous, very common objects all around the house for you to use, just in case you need them."
"That is very thoughtful of you, but I refuse to allow him to agitate me."
"Such a pity,"
Hannibal whispered, kissing his stubborn little chin.
"as I am always delighted to witness your righteous violence."
"You enjoy it rather more when you're participating," Will reminded him, and Hannibal chuckled, unable to deny it. "And having subdued you with violence, I have a confession of my own to make, Hannibal."
"Is this the troubling something you said I wouldn't like?"
he asked, feeling a pang of concern. "It is," Will confirmed, the trail of his calloused hands raising goosebumps on Hannibal's skin as Will stroked his shoulder and arm.
"As I have been thoroughly threatened by your knees, and delightfully strangled by your marvelous thighs,"
Hannibal whispered, brushing a kiss over Will's temple.
"I can hardly find the strength to be unhappy."
"Good," Will said, a raspy chuckle rumbling up from his chest. "You said that Hobbs was caught in Chesterton?"
"Yes,"
Hannibal said, tranquil and drowsy in the aftermath.
"He was shot by a constable, though, thankfully. I had the strangest fear he was trying to reach you."
"He was," Will said without flourish, turning to Tuck against his chest, stroking his shoulder to soothe him. "And he came here to Hartford, Hannibal." Hannibal went absolutely still in his embrace, blank with shock, as he tried desperately to make those words seem anything other than what they were. "Hannibal?"
"I am sorry, Will. What did you say?"
"I said that he came here," Will gently repeated, pressing soft, coaxing kisses to his jaw. "Yesterday morning." Hannibal shook his head, a tiny tendril of bleak, encompassing horror teasing through the bond despite the tight clamp he tried to put on it. "Hannibal?"
"I am trying to curb my fruitless panic, Will, by reminding myself that your guards were here with you."
"I sent them away," Will said, mouth pressing tight with sympathy when Hannibal slumped, the terror in his bond making Will nearly dizzy with the force of his fear. "Francis had vanished, and I insisted they go find him. I realize in retrospect it was not well done of me."
"No, it certainly was not. Did you have the pistol?"
"I did," Will assured him, reaching up to cup his cheek, hitching his shapely leg over Hannibal's lean hip. "He came upon me on the lane up from my office. He said he hoped to take me hostage and exchange me for Abigail, but he was really hoping to provoke you into killing him."
"Had I been there,"
Hannibal said, a shudder racking him, pure alpha frustration with nowhere to spend it out, bitter anger and rage mingling with his fear to wound him all the more.
"I certainly would have."
"Hannibal," Will said, arching up and tipping his head back, baring his neck not in a submissive gesture, but in an offering of comfort. His eyes swept closed when Hannibal buried his nose against his throat, a shudder racking his long frame. Terror for him, fear for a moment already spent, and occurring without his knowledge or awareness, absolute, dreadful certainty that there would be more of such, a deadly drama played out without himself there to affect the outcome. "I'm fine," Will purred, wrapping his arm tight over Hannibal's shoulder to smooth his spine and nape, stroking him in soothing sweeps to chase the tremble from his body. "He never got close enough to do anything more than posture, I swear it. Winston was with me, I had the pistol, and I shot him."
"God's will,"
Hannibal said, a tear-broken moan against his skin, the hot seep of tears burning against his throat.
"You might have been killed."
"But I wasn't," Will quietly reminded him, knowing that Hannibal's outrage and anger stemmed from his deep love and rightful worry. "It was all over in a heartbeat, Hannibal. I shot him. I nearly killed him."
"Why did you not tell me?"
Hannibal demanded, lifting his head, searching for Will's gaze in the darkness, but finding only frustrating shadows.
"Will, why did you not write to me? I would have come immediately."
"I found the addendum when I sat down to do just that," Will said, reaching up to find Hannibal's tears with his fingertips and smooth them away. "By the time I had recovered myself sufficiently to write to you, Jimmy and Zella were already long gone." Hannibal shook his head, confused, prompting Will to say, "Zella is the one who came and collected Hobbs with Peter's help. He asked for Jimmy's assistance in taking Hobbs to Chesterton when no one need know what happened. He feared that if Grandfather found out it would frighten him and do him too much harm in his fragile state."
"So the general consensus was to lie about it,"
Hannibal asked, the words bitter and sharp. "Hannibal, you know I wouldn't lie to you," Will said, a touch of reproach in his voice that made Hannibal drop his head, seeking the solace of his throat once more. "I couldn't even wait until morning to tell you. I didn't want to pass a night in your arms thinking I had deceived you even by omission." Hannibal clutched him close, forcing a breathless squeak from his mate when he pinned him again, needing to cover Will's body with his own in an instinctive bid to protect him from a threat that had already passed. "You protected me, Hannibal," Will murmured, grazing kisses over his forehead and down his cheeks, shifting his impressive thighs around Hannibal's hips to tuck him close. "Even from so far away, you protected me. The pistol you left for me brought Hobbs to justice with a single shot."
"Need I even mention how glad I am you bothered to carry it?"
Hannibal asked, lifting his head again to glare down in Will's general direction, his indignation tangible enough to his mate's perceptive senses.
"Considering that despite your enviably sharp intelligence, you are consistently reckless and prone to dashing straight into the mouth of danger, despite everything I attempt in order to protect you. I leave you in our home with guards and a weapon, and you—"
He cut off when Will hitched his leg up higher, sliding his knee up Hannibal's side and down again. Aghast, he sputtered,
"I refuse to be diverted by your knees. Will Lecter Graham, you will cease that this instant."
"Not when it's working," Will chuckled, clamping his sturdy legs around his husband to drag him up tight, his arms twining round Hannibal's neck to draw him down flush against him. "And you tried to divert me with your chest hair in the bath, so I'd say a little turnabout is fair play, wouldn't you?" Hannibal flushed, fairly caught out. "There's no sense getting beside yourself over something that's already over and done with, is there?" Will said, feeling Hannibal relax ever so slightly in his arms.
"I will decide when I get beside myself over. Thank you very much. I'm very cross just now."
"I can tell," Will murmured, stifling Hannibal's frustrated huff with a coaxing kiss, his heels sliding down the backs of Hannibal's thighs to wedge between them, pulling them open. "I'm sorry, Hannibal. I should have kept the guards. I should have known that Hobbs would come here. My gift is such that I felt foolish for not having anticipated he would. I wouldn't say I ran headlong into danger this time, but I will own that I should have managed myself differently. I apologize for frightening you, Hannibal."
"Damnation,"
Hannibal breathed, frustrated. As much as it upset him, Will was right in one thing. It was over and done with, and no amount of anger about it would change one whit of it, not any more.
"How am I to remain angry when you do that?"
"Do what?" Will asked, sliding his toes over the backs of Hannibal's calves and up beneath his thighs, moving to press his ankles tight at Hannibal's haunches. "Apologize? Or blatantly attempt to distract you with my knees? Perhaps I should fetch a pair of stockings and wheel you until you forgive me."
"As you have done nothing wrong, Will, my forgiveness was never in question. Only your determination to murder me with anxiety,"
Hannibal said, rapidly weakening in the face of his husband's charms and good sense. In a last-ditch effort to get his point across, he promised,
"We are going to have a discussion about your propensity to disregard my effort to protect you, and you will bloody well cover your knees when we do."
"Yes, that sounds very engaging, Hannibal," Will agreed, sliding his hands down Hannibal's taut back to grasp his backside, filling his hands with warm flesh and giving it a squeeze. "But I think I shall probably always be just as I am. I suppose the only way you'll be able to make sure I'm safe is to stay by my side, don't you think?"
"Will, do you mean?"
His questioner got lost in a kiss, and his intentions were, indeed, diverted by his husband, who was ever so much more dangerous than his knees let on. But in all honesty, they both knew he was more than willing to be distracted from his upset by Will's unrepentant determination to seduce him, and Hannibal resolved to allow the matter to rest. He was home now, after all. He was back where he belonged in his husband's warm arms, back in his place with Will, and no one, not Hobbs, nor Mason, nor this mysterious shadow who plagued them, would ever bring harm to his mate so long as he drew breath beside him.
"I do love you to absolute folly, Will. There is no doubt in my mind you will be the death of me,"
he admitted, and sank down into his husband's eager embrace to the sound of Will's soft, delighted laughter.